G'day there, Andrew Hebel here from the Association of Australian Convention Bureau. At the AACB, we value the collective market intelligence that we bring to the business events industry. And while we've been analysing Convention Bureau stats for more than 2 decades to allow members to benchmark performance, our modern bid data collection system has allowed us to examine the immediate impact of COVID-19 on Australia's business events industry. This week, we released the July edition of the Forward Calendar of International Business Events. And although the headline figure of 373 confirmed wins represents a typically healthy number of international business events for Australia into the future, 129 or 35% have been postponed from this year into 2021 and beyond, while a further 59 were cancelled. Meaning that the pipeline of future business won has been artificially inflated due to the pandemic. Likewise, the pipeline of 225 bids submitted consist of at least 41 opportunities, or 20%, that have been postponed, while a further 30 were withdrawn before a decision was made. With unprecedented competition expected for this lucrative market from countries around the world in the wake of COVID-19, it is clear that the industry will require long-term support from governments to remain competitive into the future. Having said that, it is great to see restrictions on business events and travel easing across Australia, with internal borders opening. This is providing significant opportunity for our critical domestic market. While the 1.5 physical distancing rule remains across the country where possible, let's take a look at capacity, density, and border easing in each of our states and territories. In Melbourne and regional Victoria, we've been encouraged by the results of the lockdown, with no community transmission recorded for more than 1 week. Now, no events are currently permitted, with restrictions expected to be in place until at least the 23rd of November. As such, we call on the Victorian Premier to urgently plan a pathway out specifically for the state's business and events community to provide much needed certainty for the tourism and events supply chain. In Sydney and regional New South Wales, capacity limits have doubled to 300 people since late September, with the 1 person per 4 square metre rule applying for indoors and 1 person per 2 square metres outdoors. And it's great to hear the recent exemptions for standalone exhibitions at ICC Sydney, with capacity limits now removed. Noting that New South Wales Victoria border resident restrictions have already eased, the New South Wales Premier has announced that the border will reopen to Victoria on the 23rd of November. Otherwise, there are no other restrictions in place for all other states or territories crossing the New South Wales border. In Hobart and Tasmania, capacity limits for gatherings are 250 people for indoor and 1,000 for outdoor, with a reduced density of 1 person per 2 square metres. Tasmania is currently open for the low-risk jurisdictions of South Australia, Western Australia, Northern Territory, ACT, Queensland and New South Wales, with Victoria scheduled to be classified as low risk from the 27th of November. To Queensland, including Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast in the southeast, and Mackay, Townsville, Cairns and the Great Barrier Reef, making up our tropical north. Now, all events must be able to comply with having the 1 person per 4 square metres of usable space for indoor events, and 1 person per 2 square metres for outdoor events. However, businesses with an indoor floor space less than 200 square metres can have 1 person per 2 square metres, up to 50 people at a time. Visitors from all states and territories other than Victoria and Greater Sydney and New South Wales, known as COVID-19 hotspots, can enter Queensland without having to complete mandatory quarantine. In Adelaide and South Australia, you'll find no maximum capacity restrictions, noting that the lower 1 person per 2 square metre density applies. Travellers from low community transmission zones, NT, WA, Tasmania, Queensland, ACT and New South Wales, are able to enter South Australia directly without the requirement for COVID-19 testing or 14-day self-quarantine upon arrival. Essential travellers from Victoria are permitted, and cross-border community residents can travel up to 70 kilometres into South Australia or Victoria for any reason. Perth and Western Australia, again no maximum capacity limit, but the 1 person per 2 square metre density applies. While Western Australia has imposed a hard border closure, the state plans to transition to a controlled border arrangement for the 14th of November. This means that visitors from Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, the ACT and the Northern Territory, which are considered very low risk areas, will be allowed to travel into the state and will no longer be required to self-quarantine. Darwin and the Northern Territory. No maximum capacity restrictions and uniquely, no density restrictions. There are strict border controls in place though for all arrivals with 14 days of mandatory quarantine required if you have recently been in a declared COVID-19 hotspot. However, with the recent announcement revoking Sydney and much of regional Victoria, this only leaves Greater Melbourne on the hotspot list. And finally here in Canberra and the ACT, to hold gatherings greater than 500 people, an exemption in accordance with the COVID-safe event protocol is required. Density limits of 1 person per 4 square metres indoors and 1 person per 2 square metres outdoors must always be maintained across the event site. There are strict quarantine requirements for persons arriving to the ACT from certain areas within Victoria, unless an exemption is obtained. If it has been more than 14 days since visiting an identified area of restriction or concern in Victoria, quarantine upon arrival may be required. Visitors from all other states and territories can enter the ACT without having to quarantine. Now, I hope this update has been useful, but please check with the local Convention Bureau on changes to these restrictions and on the requirements of COVID-safe events, checklists and plans as they apply to each state and territory. Stay safe and well. Cheers.